The Mandalorians are one of the most iconic and enigmatic cultures in the Star Wars universe. A people defined by their fierce warrior tradition, enigmatic customs, and intricate, often brutal, history. But to truly understand the Mandalorian mythos, we must begin at its very origins, tracing its evolution from its early conception on the desert planet of Mandalore, where a people once scattered in nomadic tribes and ruthless combat would eventually forge a unified warrior culture that would come to dominate not just their planet, but other worlds, with their indelible legacy spreading across galactic history. To grasp the full scope of the Mandalorian mythos, one must consider its mythological roots, its warrior ethos, its rise to power, and the paradoxical cultural values that both bound the Mandalorians together and drove them to conflict. This journey into the origins of the Mandalorian mythos is as much a story of identity, pride, and warfare as it is a tale of survival and the forging of a legacy that transcends generations. The beginnings of the Mandalorians are wrapped in ancient myths and legends, originating long before the rise of the Galactic Republic or even the Sith Empire. The Mandalorians' true origin is shrouded in mystery, a reflection of their culture's tendency to romanticize and mythologize their past. The core of the Mandalorian identity begins with their warrior tradition, a deeply ingrained belief that strength and combat prowess are the highest virtues one can achieve. This ideology traces back to the early days of the Mandalorians, when they were not yet a unified people, but rather a collection of scattered clans, many of whom had little in common besides their love of battle and their collective defiance of oppression. The first real origin story of the Mandalorian people begins with the discovery of Mandalore I, a figure whose legacy would define the entire culture. According to myth, Mandalore I was the leader of a primitive warrior tribe whose rise to prominence was marked by his prowess in battle and his ability to unite disparate clans under a single banner. His role as a unifier and warrior king became a symbol for what it meant to be a Mandalorian, as he established the foundations of the Mandalorian Creed. The creed itself became the backbone of Mandalorian culture, a guiding set of principles that dictated the warrior spirit, the respect for combat, and the importance of honor in battle. Mandalore I's unification of the clans also set the stage for the later establishment of the Mandalorian Super Commandos, a name that would become synonymous with elite soldiers feared across the galaxy. However, the true mythical significance of Mandalore I goes beyond his role as a military leader. He is revered in Mandalorian culture as a legendary figure, almost a demigod, who through strength and cunning forged a society that would come to be known for its warrior ethos, uncompromising honor, and never-ending pursuit of glory in battle. His legend is passed down from generation to generation, inspiring Mandalorian warriors to strive for greatness in the heat of battle and to seek personal honor through combat, a tradition that persists to this day. Over time, the Mandalorian culture evolved from these ancient roots, and their military might became known throughout the galaxy. The Mandalorians' deep-seated need to conquer and prove themselves through combat led them to clash with a wide variety of civilizations, including the Jedi, whose teachings of peace and diplomacy stood in direct contrast to the Mandalorians' battle-centric worldview. The Great Mandalorian Wars, fought between the Jedi and the Mandalorians, solidified the Mandalorians' reputation as an unstoppable force of nature, unstoppable in their drive to invade and dominate. The Mandalorians were viewed as almost mythical warriors, their ships, tactics, and weapons feared across the galaxy. Their famed Mandalorian armor, made from Beskar, an indestructible metal capable of withstanding lightsaber strikes, became a symbol of their resilience and their helmeted faces symbolized their unyielding nature in battle. The Mandalorians, having established themselves as an imposing military power, began to be seen not as just warriors, but as a living myth, a culture destined to conquer, to battle, and to impose their way of life on the galaxy. Throughout their history, the Mandalorians were never a static culture. They were always evolving, adapting, and responding to the galaxy's ever-changing political landscape. The Mandalorian Wars led to the rise of Mandalore the Ultimate, a warrior king who sought to unite the Mandalorian clans under the banner of an all-encompassing imperial vision. His vision, however, would soon clash with the Jedi Order and the Galactic Republic, leading to an epic conflict that would change the course of galactic history. The Mandalorian exile that followed the wars marked a period of deep cultural reflection and introspection for the Mandalorians, as they sought to rebuild and find a new purpose in the galaxy. This period of exile saw the rise of a new, more fragmented Mandalorian identity. The once strong and unified warrior clans were scattered, their unifying mythology fractured, and their need for conquest diminished. The Mandalorians, however, did not disappear from the galaxy. Instead, they retreated into their homes on the planet Mandalore, seeking peace after centuries of war. This period of peace and self-exploration allowed for a re-examination of the Mandalorian creed and identity, particularly the role of their warrior traditions in a galaxy that had begun to embrace the ideals of democracy, cooperation, and peace. The next stage in the development of the Mandalorian mythos came in the form of the Mandalorian Civil Wars, which marked a turning point for the culture. The rise of the Mandalorian Protectors, a faction that sought to preserve Mandalorian tradition while rejecting the violence and imperialism of the past, created a new sense of cultural identity that became crucial to the Mandalorians' survival in a rapidly changing galaxy. During this time, the Mandalorians would come to embrace their complexity. They were no longer merely warriors bent on conquest, but a people seeking identity in a galaxy where their legendary status had been reduced to myth. This cultural evolution would come full circle with the rise of the Mandalorian Crusaders, who would blend the warrior ways of their ancestors with the changing realities of the galaxy. The Crusaders forged a new identity for the Mandalorians, emphasizing the importance of family, honor, and loyalty over brute conquest. At the same time, they adopted new technologies, blending ancient combat techniques with modern warfare strategies. By the time the Clone Wars erupted, the Mandalorians were once again a key force in galactic politics. Their warrior identity would become entwined with the galactic conflict itself, as the Death Watch, a radical faction of Mandalorians, sought to re-establish the warrior ways they had abandoned. The role of Mandalore in the war would come to symbolize the re-emergence of the warrior culture, a culture that had once been written off as irrelevant, but now found itself at the center of galactic politics once again. The mythos of the Mandalorians, with its warrior creed, battle-tested honor, and desire to conquer the galaxy, would leave an indelible mark on the galaxy's culture and history. This myth, born from the harsh realities of survival on Mandalore, would shape the very nature of the Mandalorians' existence. The Mandalorian way was not just a way of life, it was a legacy of combat, tradition, and unwavering dedication to one's people and ideals. Their armor became a symbol of resilience and honor, while their warrior ethos continued to resonate through the ages, influencing countless generations, even beyond their own borders. The Mandalorian mythos is, at its core, a story of a people shaped by conflict, bound together by an unbreakable sense of identity and purpose, and destined to leave their mark on the galaxy. Though their methods and beliefs would evolve over time, The Mandalorians' desire to fight, to survive, and to shape their own fate would remain at the heart of their story, defining them as a people whose legacy would continue to resonate across the galaxy. The Mandalorian warrior culture, which had once been defined by conquest and expansion, began to shift as the galaxy itself underwent monumental changes. The Old Republic, with its rise to power and subsequent peace, was a threat to the Mandalorians' warrior-based identity. The Mandalorians, as a culture built on conflict and warfare, would find themselves increasingly isolated. Over time, their traditional values, rooted in tribal warfare, would be at odds with the unification that came with the Republic's dominance. This tension would define the Mandalorian struggle for survival and identity in a galaxy that was slowly moving away from the primal need for battle. The Mandalorian Civil Wars, a series of internal conflicts between Mandalorian factions, would begin to crystallize as a reaction to the Republic's growing influence. While the unification of Mandalore under leaders like Mandalore I had been a symbol of strength, it was now being tested by rising internal dissent. As the Mandalorians faced the growing threat of the Republic's political structure and its force of law, the warriors found themselves questioning the sustainability of their violent and conquest-driven culture. The warriors who sought control and domination clashed with those who sought preservation of their cultural heritage without relying on the bloodshed and conquest that had once been their hallmark. This internal schism led to the Mandalorian Civil Wars, a time when the warrior clans were divided and weakened. The mythological grandeur of the Mandalorian culture, which had once dominated the galaxy with their fearsome reputation, was now a memory of the past. The reality was that the Mandalorians were struggling to maintain relevance in a galaxy increasingly dominated by political unity, which the Mandalorians could not easily assimilate. The rise of Mandalore, the Ultimate, marked a pivotal moment in this struggle. The character of Mandalore the Ultimate became emblematic of the ancient warrior ethos, a leader who sought to return the Mandalorians to their glory days. His mission was clear: to restore the Mandalorian clans to their former glory through renewed war and conquest. He sought to unify the Mandalorian people under a banner of war against the Republic, seeking to overthrow the peace and security they had built. The Great Mandalorian Wars under Mandalore the Ultimate would be a critical chapter in the Mandalorian mythos, as they would be the first real test of whether the Mandalorians could regain their former glory in a galaxy that had moved beyond their warrior-based ideals. The wars would be marked by brutal conflict, but despite the fierceness of their attack, the Mandalorians were ultimately defeated by the Jedi and the Republic. This loss would set the stage for a period of exile and reflection for the Mandalorians. The Mandalorian warriors had once been seen as nearly invincible, but their defeat would force them to consider their place in the galaxy and their future as a people. Following the Mandalorian exile, the mythos of the Mandalorians would shift from one of domination and empire building to one of survival and redefinition. During this period of reflection, the Mandalorians would retreat into their own world of Mandalore, becoming more insular and focused on their internal development. This period marked a transformation in the Mandalorian identity. The external wars had ended, but internal struggles continued. The question of whether the Mandalorians would continue as a people defined by violence, or whether they could find a new path, would occupy the Mandalorian spirit for generations to come. The myths surrounding the Mandalorian creed evolved, and the tales of honor, strength, and combat were gradually augmented with stories of survival, rebuilding, and growth. It was no longer enough to conquer. The Mandalorians needed to define what it meant to be a warrior in a galaxy at peace. The period following the Mandalorian exile saw the emergence of Mandalorian protectors, a faction of Mandalorians who rejected the extreme violence of the past and instead sought to preserve the Mandalorian heritage without the conquest-driven ideals that had once guided them. The protectors would become guardians of the Mandalorian way of life, dedicated to defending Mandalore rather than conquering the galaxy. They would see themselves as the inheritors of the Mandalorian mythos, but their goal would not be to enforce that legacy through war, but through protection, honor, and unity within their own people. In contrast, radical factions like the Death Watch, which embraced the return of the Mandalorian warrior tradition, would seek to return to the old ways of battle and conquest, refusing to adapt to the changing reality of galactic politics. The Death Watch's opposition to the Protectors would further fracture the Mandalorian people, pulling them in two directions: the past, steeped in combat, and the future, marked by the desire to preserve their culture peacefully. These tensions would continue throughout Mandalorian history, especially as the galaxy entered the Clone Wars. The Republic and the Sith, now embroiled in a galaxy-wide conflict, would pull the Mandalorians back into the fold of galactic politics, but in a new and different way. The rise of Darth Maul and the Mandalorian Civil War during this time would force the Mandalorians to choose between remaining as an isolated warrior culture or joining the larger conflict. The impact of this choice would reverberate across the Mandalorian mythos, as their place in galactic history would be once again defined by their participation in the larger political conflicts of the galaxy. Mandalorians would once again be caught in a struggle for survival, but this time, the stakes were higher. Their warrior tradition, which had long been their identity, would be tested once again by larger galactic forces that were shifting in the wake of the Clone Wars. The war brought about the rise of Mandalore the Preserver, a leader who sought to restore Mandalore's strength without reverting to the violent conquest of the past. He would introduce a new form of Mandalorian identity, one focused on honor, loyalty, and unity rather than domination. This shift would be further solidified by the role the Mandalorians played in the aftermath of the war, as they tried to find their place within a galaxy that was now dominated by the Empire and later the New Republic. The Mandalorians' role in these new political structures would redefine their place in the galaxy, once again shifting the Mandalorian mythos from one of warrior conquest to one of galactic relevance. The Mandalorian mythos, once defined by warrior kings and galactic conquest, would eventually evolve into a culture of preservation, adaptation, and survival. Mandalorians would learn to evolve without losing their identity, adapting to a galaxy that no longer demanded constant warfare. They would move from being conquerors to being preservers of their people, guardians of their culture, and keepers of their ancient traditions. Their armor would remain a symbol of their enduring spirit, and their code of honor would become a beacon of resilience. The Mandalorian mythos, while rooted in the brutal traditions of battle and conquest, would find its true expression in the strength to endure, adapt, and evolve as a people, despite the ever-changing tides of galactic history. The Clone Wars would prove to be a defining moment in the Mandalorian mythos, reshaping their identity as they were thrust into the heart of a galaxy-wide conflict. As the Republic and the Separatists fought for control, the Mandalorians, who had once been a fierce and formidable military force, were now at a crossroads. Their past was deeply rooted in warrior culture, but the Republic's rising power and the overwhelming presence of the Jedi Order presented an opportunity for the Mandalorians to redefine their role in the galaxy. The wars would see the Mandalorians once again involved in large-scale military conflicts, though this time, the nature of their participation would differ greatly from their previous campaigns. The first major shift came with the rise of Death Watch, a radical faction of the Mandalorian people that rejected the peaceful direction taken by the government of Mandalore under Duchess Satine Kryze. Satine's pacifist stance, which sought to keep Mandalore neutral and avoid further military conflict, was viewed by the Death Watch as a betrayal of Mandalorian values. They saw her as a threat to the warrior spirit that had defined Mandalore for centuries, and they sought to restore Mandalore's strength through war, as it had been in the time of Mandalore the Ultimate. The ideological split within the Mandalorians, between those seeking peace and those eager to return to their warlike ways, would serve as a microcosm of the larger conflict in the galaxy, with factions vying for power and direction. The Death Watch, under the leadership of Pre Vizsla, aimed to overthrow Satine's government and restore Mandalore's military might, even aligning themselves with Darth Maul and his criminal syndicate, the Shadow Collective, during the war. The Death Watch's actions would ultimately embroil Mandalore in the broader galactic struggle, with Mandalore the Protector emerging as a figure who sought to stabilize the planet amidst the chaos. This period of civil unrest, marked by internal strife, would serve as a cultural reckoning for the Mandalorians. They were no longer simply a people of warriors and conquerors, but had to face the reality that their culture had evolved into something more complex. The rising influence of the Death Watch would underscore the continued importance of Mandalorian identity, but it would also expose the fractures within the Mandalorian community. The mythos of the Mandalorians would no longer just be about conquest, but about the struggle for self-definition in a galaxy increasingly dominated by external forces. In this new era, the Mandalorian Protectorate, under the leadership of Bo-Katan Kryze, would attempt to rebuild Mandalore in a new image. Bo-Katan, a former member of the Death Watch, would realize that Mandalore's future could not be defined solely by war, but by unity and internal reconciliation. The new Mandalore she sought to build was one that would find peace, but at the cost of the warrior traditions that had once defined her people. This shift was not easy, as it required a delicate balance between maintaining Mandalore's cultural identity as a warrior people while also coming to terms with the fact that their violent past might have been a relic in an era of galactic peace. The struggle between the pacifists and the warriors would continue to haunt Mandalore, even as the planet tried to carve out a new future. The Mandalorians' role in the Clone Wars would not be as active participants in the battle between the Jedi and the Sith, but rather as reluctant allies or enemies caught in the galactic tides. Some Mandalorian factions would become mercenaries, offering their expertise in combat and defense, while others would stay neutral or, in the case of the Death Watch, directly oppose the Republic. The cultural mythos of the Mandalorians, long rooted in the idea of honor through combat, would now be reshaped into one where Mandalorians were not just soldiers of fortune, but players in a much larger galactic game, trying to find their place in a galaxy where old methods of war were no longer seen as the answer. As the Clone Wars ended, the galaxy would enter a period of reconstruction, with the rise of the Galactic Empire marking the collapse of the Republic. The Mandalorians, having already been so deeply divided by their internal struggles, would face even greater challenges. The newly formed empire, which sought to consolidate power and order across the galaxy, would have little use for the Mandalorians, whose warrior ways no longer fit into the Empire's authoritarian agenda. Mandalore, once a hub of military power and prestige, would find itself on the fringes of galactic politics. The mythos of the Mandalorians, once an unstoppable force of warriors, would now be reduced to a myth, a relic of a bygone era. However, the Mandalorians would not fade into obscurity. While the Empire sought to eradicate the Mandalorian threat, a small but determined group of Mandalorian rebels would begin to form in response to the Empire's occupation. These Mandalorian resistance fighters would serve as the last vestiges of their warrior culture, using their expertise in combat to fight for freedom and independence against the Empire's oppressive rule. Though their numbers were small, the Mandalorian spirit would endure, driven by a sense of pride, resilience, and the need to protect their people. The Mandalorian mythos, now redefined, would become a symbol of defiance against tyranny, and the warrior spirit that had once sought domination would now fight for the preservation of their cultural identity in the face of overwhelming oppression. The eventual fall of the Empire and the rise of the New Republic would offer a new chapter for the Mandalorians, one where they could finally attempt to heal the rifts caused by years of conflict and war. However, the Mandalorians' past would always linger, and their struggle to maintain their identity would continue. The Mandalorian mythos, once solely defined by battle and conquest, would evolve into a more nuanced story of survival, adaptation, and legacy. The Mandalorians would become a people defined not just by their warrior past, but by their ability to survive, adapt, and persevere in a galaxy that had long moved beyond the need for endless war. As we look at the legacy of the Mandalorians, from the days of Mandalore I to the rise of Bo-Katan Kryze, we see a culture that has undergone dramatic evolution. The Mandalorian's mythos was not static, it was a living legend, one that adapted to the shifting tides of galactic history. The transition from a society defined by conquest and warrior dominance to one that valued survival and self-preservation marks the enduring strength of the Mandalorians. Their legacy, though forged in the heat of battle, would ultimately be remembered not just for their fearsome combat skills, but for their ability to evolve in a galaxy that had forever changed. After the fall of the Galactic Empire, the galaxy found itself in a period of political upheaval and reconstruction. The New Republic, established in the wake of the Empire's destruction, sought to bring peace and democracy to the galaxy. But while the Republic was focused on rebuilding, many of the galaxy's more fragmented and independent peoples, such as the Mandalorians, found themselves trying to redefine their place in this new world order. The Mandalorians, whose warrior culture had once defined them as a dominant military force, were now reduced to exiles, mercenaries, and fugitives, scattered across the galaxy and struggling to survive. For the Mandalorians, the post-Empire era would mark a time of reflection, adaptation, and survival. Though the Mandalorian warrior culture was still a powerful part of their identity, it was no longer a defining force in galactic politics. The galaxy had moved beyond large-scale wars and constant conquest. The Mandalorians would need to find new ways to honor their traditions while adapting to a galaxy that was increasingly seeking peace, diplomacy, and stability. The Mandalorian exile had taught them the importance of preservation, not just through combat, but through cooperation and unity. The mythos of the Mandalorians had evolved from the proud warrior clans of old to a people whose strength lay in their resilience and adaptability. The Mandalorian identity during this period would be shaped by the resurgence of Mandalore, the homeworld of the Mandalorian people. Mandalore, once a thriving planet of warriors, was now a desolate and war-torn world, scarred by the conflicts of the past. The Great Purge, a devastating event that saw the Empire target the Mandalorians for their refusal to ally with the Empire, had left the planet in ruins. The Mandalorian people, scattered across the galaxy, found themselves divided into various factions, each with their own vision of what it meant to be a Mandalorian. The Mandalorian mythos, once unified by a shared culture of conquest, was now fractured by different ideologies and political divisions. The resistance movement that arose in the aftermath of the Empire's fall would see a new generation of Mandalorians. These individuals, though connected to the old traditions, would have to adapt to a new galaxy. The Mandalorian protectors, who had once been tasked with protecting the people of Mandalore, would now take on a new role as guardians of their cultural heritage. Their role would evolve from that of simple defenders to leaders in a galaxy that was no longer defined by warfare, but by intergalactic diplomacy, trade, and peace. The new Mandalorian leaders, including figures like Bo-Katan Kryze, would work to unite the Mandalorians under a banner of rebuilding rather than conquest. They would seek to restore Mandalore to its former glory, not by returning to old methods of war, but by using their unique skills in a peaceful way. This period would also see the rise of new Mandalorian heroes, figures who would embody the ideals of honor, loyalty, and unity, but who would do so in a galaxy that was no longer defined by battle. The rise of Din Djarin, the titular character of the Mandalorian series, would mark a new chapter in the Mandalorian mythos. Din, a lone Mandalorian bounty hunter, would symbolize the fractured and isolated state of the Mandalorians in the aftermath of the Empire's fall. His journey would take him not only through the outer reaches of the galaxy, but also into the heart of Mandalorian identity itself. His story would be one of survival, but also of rediscovery and reclamation, as he reconnects with the deeper values of Mandalore's ancient past and begins to understand the importance of unity in a galaxy that has long moved beyond war. Din Djarin's involvement with the child Grogu, a Force-sensitive being, would also have profound implications for the Mandalorians. The discovery of Grogu, and the eventual connection between Mandalorians and the Jedi, would represent the merging of two long-standing rival traditions: the Jedi's commitment to peace and the Mandalorians' warrior ethos. This alliance would demonstrate that the Mandalorians were no longer just defined by battle, but by their ability to adapt and find new meaning in a galaxy at peace. Through this collaboration, the Mandalorians would continue to rebuild their cultural legacy and rediscover their spiritual roots, which had once been lost in the pursuit of war. In the New Republic era, the Mandalorians would continue to play a role in galactic politics, albeit not through the conquest-driven paths of old. The Mandalorians' role as mercenaries, warriors, and peacekeepers would redefine their mythology as they struggled to find their place in a galaxy that had moved on from the battles and wars that once defined them. They would evolve into a people of honor and resilience, maintaining their identity and traditions while also adapting to the changing galactic landscape. The Mandalorians, who had once been feared as ruthless conquerors, would be remembered as a people who could survive, even thrive, in a galaxy where their warrior culture had been relegated to myth. Ultimately, the Mandalorian mythos would endure, not just as a story of battle and conquest, but as a story of resilience, adaptation, and the eternal fight for identity. In a galaxy that constantly changes, the Mandalorians would serve as a reminder of the importance of culture, heritage, and the ability to evolve without losing one's sense of self. Their journey from fierce warriors to survivors of a new galaxy would prove that their legacy was not built solely on battle, but on their indomitable will to endure. As the New Republic attempted to establish itself as a beacon of peace and stability in the galaxy, the Mandalorians, like many other cultures, found themselves grappling with the reality of their past. The galaxy was recovering from the devastation of the Galactic Civil War, and the need for new allegiances and alliances had never been more apparent. The Mandalorians were a people shaped by decades of war, internal strife, and survival, but the Republic's emphasis on cooperation and peaceful coexistence presented a fundamental challenge to the Mandalorian identity. The warrior culture that had long been their defining feature now had to evolve in a galaxy where military conquest was no longer the prevailing form of conflict. In the midst of this turmoil, Mandalore found itself struggling to reclaim its place in galactic politics. The Mandalorians, once feared and revered for their military might, were now outsiders in the broader galactic community. Their historical alliances and enmities, from their conflicts with the Jedi to their association with the Sith, had left them with little political capital. The Mandalorians' role in the galaxy had shifted from being warriors and conquerors to survivors and advisors, trying to carve out a new future for their people without returning to the old ways. The story of the Mandalorians in the New Republic era begins to emerge with the rise of new figures, individuals like Bo-Katan, Kryze, and Din Djarin, who would embody the new spirit of Mandalorian survival and unity. Both would symbolize different paths within the broader Mandalorian cultural spectrum, reflecting the tension between tradition and adaptation. Bo-Katan, a seasoned warrior and leader, would struggle with the legacy of her people's past while working toward a future in which the Mandalorians would no longer rely on war to define their existence. Din Djarin, on the other hand, would serve as a figure of individual redemption, a Mandalorian who fought not for conquest, but for honor, loyalty, and survival, all while navigating the challenges of living in a galaxy scarred by war and controlled by larger political forces. As the Mandalorian mythos continued to evolve, these figures would become key in shaping the way Mandalorians viewed their place in the galaxy. While the galaxy was recovering, the Mandalorians were once again at a crossroads. Should they return to their warrior ways and conquer, or should they continue to adapt, working within the confines of the New Republic to build a new future for their people? This internal struggle would continue to shape the Mandalorian identity and would play a crucial role in their participation in the galactic political structure. One of the defining features of Mandalorian culture in this era would be their armor. The Mandalorian helmet and Beskar armor would become symbols not just of combat, but of identity and heritage. For Din Djarin, his armor would be a representation of his heritage, a link to the past that gave him his strength, but also a reminder of the need to adapt and survive in a galaxy that no longer needed warriors to wage endless battles. The armor, long thought to symbolize the uncompromising warrior culture, would come to represent survival, adaptation, and the evolution of the Mandalorians as they navigated their place in the galaxy's new order. The galaxy, too, had changed. The rise of the Empire had been followed by the fall of the New Republic, but there was now an opportunity for independent peoples like the Mandalorians to carve out their own future without being bound by the past. The rise of the Mandalorian clans, once divided by war, betrayal, and conflict, now found themselves attempting to unite, but under new conditions. Mandalore itself was struggling to rebuild after the devastating destruction caused by the Empire, which had marked their world as a symbol of rebellion and resistance. The clan system, once a divisive force, began to find renewed importance as the Mandalorians sought to reconnect with their roots and preserve their traditions. The Mandalorian creed, the belief in strength, honor, and survival would be reaffirmed, but now as a more inclusive, peaceful force. While the Mandalorians would not forget their roots in battle, they would begin to find new ways to practice their culture through diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange. The Mandalorian culture, previously defined by its reputation for warfare, would come to be known for its ability to adapt to changing times and serve as a bridge between old traditions and new possibilities. In the years following the establishment of the New Republic, the Mandalorians would have to navigate the shifting galactic politics. The Republic's shaky leadership would provide an opening for the Mandalorians to reclaim their influence on the galactic stage. Bo-Katan, having witnessed the downfall of her people, would be crucial in leading the Mandalorians not just to survival but to revival, seeking new ways for them to engage with the galaxy in ways that didn't rely solely on military prowess. While the Mandalorians would always be connected to their martial history, the future of their culture would depend on their ability to forge new alliances, integrate into the galactic system, and preserve their heritage in a galaxy that had long moved beyond the need for constant war. As the Mandalorians attempted to rebuild, they would also remember the painful lessons of their past, the wars, the betrayals, the fractures within their own people. But in remembering these lessons, they would also reaffirm the values that made them strong: loyalty, honor, and the ability to adapt to an ever-changing galaxy. In this period of reflection and adaptation, the Mandalorians would come to realize that they were not just survivors of a lost war, but a people with a unique legacy to contribute to the galaxy. The Mandalorian mythos was not just a story of warriors and conquerors, but a story of resilience, one that would echo through the galaxy for generations to come. The galactic landscape had dramatically shifted following the fall of the Empire. The New Republic was born out of the ashes of the old, but its authority and stability were always in question. The Mandalorians, once a people whose identity had been defined by their warrior ethos, now found themselves navigating a galaxy that was changing, a galaxy where conquest and war were no longer the dominant forces. The rise of the New Republic and the decline of the Empire left the Mandalorians with a stark choice: adapt or be left behind. In the post-Empire era, Mandalore, the homeworld of the Mandalorians, was a planet in turmoil, devastated by war, plundered by the Empire, and scarred by betrayal. Mandalore was no longer the proud, vibrant hub of Mandalorian culture that it had once been. The Great Purge of the Mandalorians under the Empire had left the planet fractured, its people scattered across the galaxy. The traditional Mandalorian way of life, focused on honor, combat, and military might, was now forced to confront a galaxy that no longer held war and conquest as the defining ideals. This new reality presented the Mandalorians with a profound challenge. How could a culture built on conquest and battle evolve in a galaxy that was striving for peace, cooperation, and unity? The Mandalorian exile during this period became a significant aspect of their mythos. In a time of relative peace, the Mandalorians had to rebuild both their society and their identity. The old ways of war and domination were no longer sustainable, and many Mandalorians, particularly the more traditionalist factions, began to question whether their warrior identity had a place in the galaxy. The Mandalorian creed, once a symbol of strength through battle, would undergo a profound transformation during this time, as new generations of Mandalorians sought a new meaning in a galaxy that demanded peace. Bo-Katan Kryze, a significant figure in the Mandalorian mythos, would emerge as one of the central figures during this period of reconstruction. Having been a part of the Death Watch, a faction that sought to restore Mandalore's warrior past, Bo-Katan had witnessed firsthand the destruction wrought by the cycle of violence and war. As a leader in the post-Empire era, she would work tirelessly to unite the Mandalorian people, focusing not just on reclaiming their heritage, but on adapting it to the new realities of the galaxy. Her leadership would mark the transition from a culture defined by warrior conquest to one focused on preservation, unity, and cooperation within the broader galactic order. However, Din Djarin, the central character of the Mandalorian series, would represent another facet of the evolving Mandalorian mythos. As a lone bounty hunter, Din's journey would embody the complex tension between Mandalorian identity and the need to adapt to a galaxy that no longer revolved around endless conflict. His story would reflect the personal redemption of a Mandalorian who had once been defined by the strict code of the old warrior ways, but who would come to understand that the true strength of his people lay in loyalty, honor, and survival, rather than unrelenting battle. His journey alongside Grogu, the child, would further deepen his connection to the Mandalorian creed and the greater legacy of the Mandalorians. Through his experiences, he would learn that the mythos of the Mandalorians was not simply about fighting, but about sustaining their people and preserving their culture. The growing influence of the Mandalorians in the post-Empire era would also be marked by their interactions with other factions, particularly the Jedi and the New Republic. While the Mandalorians had once been sworn enemies of the Jedi, the need for unity in the galaxy after the fall of the Empire would bring about an unexpected reconciliation. The Jedi, who had long viewed the Mandalorians as dangerous and unpredictable, would find common ground with them, recognizing that both groups had been forged in the crucible of war and survival. This new understanding would be crucial for the Mandalorians' integration into the broader galactic community. While still maintaining their warrior identity, the Mandalorians would now work alongside the Jedi and the New Republic to preserve peace and order, not through the sword, but through cooperation and shared purpose. In this new era, the Mandalorian mythos would evolve into something far more than just a collection of warrior legends. The Mandalorian story would now be one of resilience, adaptation, and preservation. Their armor, once a symbol of their warrior prowess, would now represent their ability to survive in a galaxy that had long since left behind the age of endless warfare. The mythos of the Mandalorians would become a testament to their ability to endure, to evolve, and to adapt to an ever-changing galaxy. At the same time, the legacy of war would always remain a part of Mandalorian culture. The Mandalorians, like many other cultures in the galaxy, would continue to honor their warrior heritage, but they would do so with a new understanding of balance. The idea of honor would still be central to the Mandalorian identity, but now it would be understood as a concept that transcended mere combat. The honor of the Mandalorians would be defined not just by their ability to fight, but by their ability to preserve their people, protect their traditions, and adapt to a galaxy where war was no longer the answer to every challenge. The Mandalorian mythos would continue to evolve, but at its heart, it would remain a story of identity, honor, and resilience. The Mandalorians, having once been defined by their war-driven culture, would now be remembered for their survival and their ability to change. In a galaxy that had seen countless empires rise and fall, the Mandalorians would stand as a testament to the enduring strength of those who, despite all odds, could adapt to the times and survive the greatest challenges. In the post-Empire era, as the New Republic struggled to assert its control across a fractured galaxy, the Mandalorians found themselves at a pivotal moment in their history. No longer bound solely by their warrior culture, the Mandalorians sought to reclaim their identity, not through military conquest, but through diplomatic engagement, cultural preservation, and strategic alliances. Their journey from warriors to survivors had fundamentally altered their place in the galaxy, but the question remained, could the Mandalorians fully embrace their new role without losing the very essence of their identity? The Mandalorian mythos had long been defined by their indomitable will, their pride, and their honor in battle. However, the galaxy had changed. The Empire had been defeated, the Jedi Order was largely in ruins, and the Sith were no longer the dominant force they had once been. The galaxy, now seeking stability, required unity rather than constant conflict. The Mandalorians, with their history of warfare and conquest, had to come to terms with the new reality of galactic peace, a peace that required the cooperation of formerly divided peoples and factions. Their warrior heritage was no longer enough. They needed to evolve and define their role in a galaxy where war was no longer seen as the only solution. This adaptation was not without its challenges. The Mandalorian Creed, a set of values rooted in battle and honor, had become a myth for many in the galaxy. The Mandalorian armor, once synonymous with unmatched strength and fearlessness, now represented something more complex, a symbol of the balance between the past and the future. The Mandalorians had been forced to evolve into something beyond just warriors, becoming guardians of their culture, preservers of their people, and advocates for their own unique way of life in a galaxy that had changed around them. One of the most significant consequences of this transformation was the rise of the Mandalorian resistance and their subsequent role in galactic diplomacy. As the New Republic established its authority over the galaxy, Mandalore sought not to oppose the Republic, but to assert its sovereignty in a peaceful manner. The Mandalorians, led by figures like Bo-Katan Kryze, would strive to negotiate their place within the broader galactic structure. The Republic, although established as a force for peace, had to come to terms with the fact that the Mandalorians were not easily assimilated into the traditional structures of governance. The Mandalorians had always been a people who valued their independence and their warrior identity, and the New Republic had to find a way to respect that identity while incorporating them into the larger galactic community. The Mandalorians' position as guardians of their own heritage would make them critical allies for the New Republic in their efforts to maintain peace and stability. While they could not fully abandon their martial history, the Mandalorians were more than just a military force. They represented something deeper, a resilient culture that had survived centuries of war, exile, and oppression. In the post-Empire galaxy, the Mandalorians' role was not just about maintaining power, but about ensuring their culture would endure through peace, trade, and intergalactic diplomacy. The Mandalorians' transition into this new era would also be marked by their relationship with other factions. Their old enemies, the Jedi Order and the Sith, had long been at odds with the Mandalorians. The Jedi, who had been antagonistic toward the Mandalorians during the Mandalorian Wars, would now be forced to reconsider their views. Though the Jedi Order had been nearly destroyed, there were still remnants of their teachings and ideals in the galaxy. The Mandalorians, in their new form, could potentially serve as protectors and defenders of the galaxy, not as conquerors, but as a stabilizing force. Similarly, the Sith, though diminished after the fall of the Empire, still had remnants that posed a threat to the galaxy's peace. The Mandalorians would find themselves in a delicate position. Their warrior traditions, which had once seen them in direct conflict with the Jedi and Sith, now made them natural adversaries to the dark side of the Force. While the Mandalorians would never fully align themselves with the Jedi, they would find common ground in their mutual goal of resisting the rise of the Sith. The Jedi's moral philosophy and the Mandalorians' pragmatic approach to survival would allow them to forge a unique and important alliance. Together, they would protect the galaxy from the ever-present danger of the dark side. Another aspect of the Mandalorians' new role in the galaxy would be their influence on other warrior cultures. The Mandalorians, with their storied past and their unique understanding of combat and honor, would serve as mentors and guides for other warrior factions who were similarly searching for their place in the new galaxy. The Mandalorians' teachings would spread, influencing other cultures that were torn by war or seeking a way to preserve their way of life without resorting to constant conflict. The Mandalorians would mentor these groups, sharing their lessons in survival, strength, and identity. Through this, they would continue to shape the galaxy, ensuring that their legacy lived on in more than just their own people. The final aspect of the Mandalorian mythos' evolution would be their role as survivors. The Mandalorians, who had once been defined by their drive to conquer, were now a people focused on endurance. The myths of the Mandalorian warriors who fought for glory and domination would give way to stories of Mandalorians who fought for survival, family, and honor. The Mandalorians, as a people, would now embody the idea that strength was not just about power or military might, but about the ability to endure and adapt to an ever-changing galaxy. Their mythos would endure as a testament to resilience, a legacy that could inspire future generations to preserve and honor their past, while continuing to build a future where survival, not domination, was the true measure of strength. In the aftermath of the Empire's fall, the Mandalorians were left to navigate a galaxy that was no longer dominated by war. However, they could not completely abandon the traditions that had shaped them for centuries. The Mandalorian creed, though evolving, would continue to define them. Their identity was, and still is, intricately bound to honor, survival, and self-reliance, principles that had been crucial to their existence throughout their history. As the galaxy transitioned into an era of relative peace under the New Republic, the Mandalorians found themselves at the crossroads of history, struggling to adapt while preserving their unique cultural identity. The post-Empire era would see the Mandalorians not as conquerors, but as guardians of their heritage and culture. The Mandalorians, while no longer the military juggernauts they once were, would still be respected and feared for their ability to survive and adapt. Mandalore, though devastated, would eventually become a symbol of their resilience, a broken world that still had the potential to rise again. The challenges Mandalore faced in rebuilding its population, its infrastructure, and its place in the galaxy would be as much about the preservation of culture as about the material reconstruction of the planet. The Mandalorians' role in the New Republic would remain a delicate balance. The Republic itself, though founded on the ideals of democracy and cooperation, had never fully integrated the Mandalorians into its political framework. The Mandalorians were independent, strong-willed, and deeply rooted in a culture of self-sufficiency. As the Republic continued to deal with the aftermath of the Empire's fall, the Mandalorians would have to decide whether to fully embrace the ideals of the Republic or continue to pursue their own path, maintaining their autonomy while cooperating with the new galactic government. A crucial aspect of the Mandalorians' relationship with the New Republic would be the Mandalorian Bounty Hunter Guild. The bounty hunters, many of whom were Mandalorians, had long played a significant role in galactic conflicts, often as mercenaries, hired guns, or agents of diplomacy. As the Republic established its control over more systems, the Bounty Hunter Guild would continue to serve as a bridge between the various factions in the galaxy, including the Mandalorians. The bounty hunters would serve as both protectors of the Mandalorian people and as pragmatic players in the galaxy's shifting politics. The guild would represent a more pragmatic, business-driven approach to survival, balancing the Mandalorian warrior code with the demands of a galaxy that increasingly relied on covert operations, intelligence, and diplomacy rather than direct military confrontation. At the same time, Mandalorian warriors like Din Djarin would represent a new generation of Mandalorians, individuals who were connected to the warrior past, but also shaped by the changing dynamics of the galaxy. Din Djarin's journey, which began as a bounty hunter for hire, would become symbolic of the evolving Mandalorian identity. Over time, his allegiance to the Creed, his interactions with Grogu the Child, and his eventual role in reuniting Mandalorians would reflect the Mandalorians' shifting values. No longer just a people defined by warfare, the Mandalorians were now navigating the complexities of identity, family, and community in a galaxy that no longer demanded their battle prowess, but required their resilience and unity. Mandalore itself would become the focal point of these efforts. While some factions like the Death Watch would continue to uphold the old ways, others, such as those following Bo-Katan Kryze, would advocate for a new era of Mandalore that emphasized the preservation of culture, unity, and reconstruction. This would not be easy, as the political factions that had once divided the Mandalorians would still have their influence, and the old ideals of conquest would never be fully erased. However, the leadership of figures like Bo-Katan and Din Djarin would help guide the Mandalorians toward a future where their warrior culture was not about conquest, but about defending their people and honoring their history. In the broader galactic context, the Mandalorians would continue to play a unique role in shaping the future of the galaxy. They were a people marked by their independence, their resilience, and their warrior spirit. But as the galaxy shifted towards a future that valued cooperation, understanding, and unity, the Mandalorians would face the challenge of adapting while maintaining their cultural essence. This tension between adaptation and tradition would be a defining feature of the Mandalorian mythos moving forward. One of the key aspects of this ongoing evolution would be the role of the Mandalorian Creed. As the galaxy embraced new ideologies, particularly the Jedi and Republic values, the Mandalorians would continue to hold fast to their creed, but in a way that would reflect the changing needs of the galaxy. The Creed, which had once been a strict code of warrior conduct, would evolve into a more inclusive and flexible set of guiding principles. It would no longer be about conquest and war, but about honor, loyalty, and defending the Mandalorian way of life. The Mandalorian identity, while still tied to its warrior roots, would be defined by the Mandalorian's ability to adapt and survive in an ever-changing galaxy. In the years following the formation of the New Republic, the Mandalorians would continue to rebuild their culture, redefining themselves as more than just warriors, but as a people who had survived the worst the galaxy had to offer and emerged stronger. Their mythos would continue to inspire future generations, who would look to the Mandalorians not just for their ability to fight, but for their ability to endure, to adapt, and to survive. The Mandalorians' legacy in the aftermath of the Empire's fall would be one of resilience, adaptation, and an unyielding drive to preserve their culture and heritage while navigating the complexities of a galaxy that had learned to value peace and diplomacy over the brute force of warfare. The core principles of the Mandalorian Creed, which had once been built on the tenets of strength through battle, would evolve into a broader philosophy that focused on survival, unity, and the protection of their people. This transition was not a simple one. The Mandalorians had long been a people defined by conquest and honor in battle, and their mythos was rooted in stories of ancient wars, legendary warriors, and battle victories. However, the need to survive in the post-Empire era required them to evolve and adapt to a new galaxy where constant warfare was no longer the defining feature of galactic politics. Instead, The Mandalorians would have to find their place in the new galactic order, one defined by the New Republic, a government built on democracy, cooperation, and interdependence. The Mandalorians' ability to adapt would be their greatest strength. While their warrior traditions would never be abandoned, they would no longer be bound solely to the battlefield. Instead, they would take on new roles as guardians of their culture, diplomats, and preservers of the values that had defined their people for millennia. This new approach would see them become not only protectors of Mandalore, but also active participants in the larger political and cultural dynamics of the galaxy. A significant part of this evolution would involve the preservation of Mandalore itself. Once a barren world scarred by decades of war, Mandalore would slowly begin its reconstruction. The restoration of Mandalore was not just about rebuilding its physical structures, but also about restoring the Mandalorian identity that had been lost during the Empire's occupation and the Mandalorian exile. The Mandalorian homeworld would once again become a focal point of Mandalorian culture, but now it would be a symbol of both resilience and rebirth. Mandalore would stand as a reminder that the Mandalorians had survived the worst the galaxy had thrown at them, and they had emerged not as conquerors but as survivors and protectors of their way of life. The challenge for the Mandalorians in this new era would be finding a way to preserve their warrior traditions while also ensuring that their culture did not remain stuck in the past. Their ability to adapt to the needs of the galaxy, to work alongside the New Republic, and to define themselves in a peaceful era would mark the next stage of the Mandalorian mythos. The Creed, which had once been a strict code of battle, would transform into a more inclusive set of principles that emphasized honor, loyalty, and the protection of their people. While the Mandalorians would still value combat prowess, the mythology of the Mandalorians would no longer be defined solely by their military might, but by their ability to endure and adapt to a changing galaxy. The role of the Mandalorians in the New Republic would also evolve. While their warrior culture had once been viewed with suspicion by the Jedi and the Republic, they would gradually come to be seen as respected allies. The Mandalorians' expertise in combat and defense would be invaluable in a galaxy still struggling with the aftermath of the Empire's tyranny. They would serve as peacekeepers, offering their strength and knowledge to maintain order in a galaxy that had been scarred by war. Their Mandalorian identity, once solely defined by battle, would now be a tool for ensuring galactic stability and peace. In the years that followed, the Mandalorians would serve as a bridge between the past and the future. Their cultural influence would extend beyond Mandalore, as other systems and cultures would look to the Mandalorians as a symbol of endurance. The Mandalorians would become a beacon for other warrior cultures, showing them that it was possible to honor tradition and heritage while also embracing the changes of the galaxy. This influence would be felt not just in the political sphere, but in the cultural and philosophical aspects of galactic life. The new generation of Mandalorians, raised in the aftermath of the Empire and the rise of the New Republic, would be at the forefront of this transformation. They would grow up not in the midst of wars of conquest, but in a galaxy that demanded adaptation and cooperation. These young Mandalorians would still be taught the importance of honor, courage, and loyalty, but they would also be taught to value peace, diplomacy, and unity. The Mandalorian Creed, which had once been a call to arms, would now be a call to preserve and adapt, to honor the legacy of their warrior ancestors, while building a future that embraced a more complex, cooperative galaxy. At the same time, the Mandalorian mythos would continue to be passed down from generation to generation. The stories of ancient warriors, epic battles, and legendary leaders would still be told, but they would now be framed not as tales of conquest, but as lessons of survival, honor, and the importance of unity. The Mandalorian mythos would live on as a living, breathing culture that adapted to its surroundings and embraced the challenges of a galaxy that had changed beyond recognition. In the years following the Empire's collapse, the Mandalorians would find themselves drawn into the post-Empire galaxy's reconstruction. With the New Republic striving to establish peace and unity in the galaxy, the Mandalorians, once a symbol of military might, would now be tasked with redefining their role in a new, more diplomatic galaxy. While their warrior spirit and honor would still remain vital to their identity, they would now have to balance their desire for independence and freedom with the need to cooperate with the greater galactic community. The Mandalorians' future role would be that of peacekeepers and cultural stewards, bridging the divide between warrior traditions and modern peacekeeping efforts. They would no longer be just mercenaries or conquerors, but would instead become respected figures within the broader galactic landscape. The New Republic would look to the Mandalorians not as a threat, but as valuable allies in maintaining peace in a galaxy that had seen too much conflict. Their warrior history, while still honored, would now be directed toward the preservation of Mandalore and their unique way of life. The Mandalorians' transition from warrior culture to cultural preservers would symbolize the broader shift in the galaxy, where old rivalries and conflicts had given way to a more collaborative future. The Mandalorians would work alongside the Jedi, Republic officials, and independent planetary governments to maintain peace in the galaxy. Their combat prowess, while still respected, would be used sparingly, as the galaxy moved away from military solutions and instead embraced diplomacy and unification. While Mandalore itself would continue to serve as the heart of the Mandalorian people, their influence would spread across the galaxy. The Mandalorian culture would be seen as one of survival, adaptation, and honor. They would become a symbol of resilience, showing that a people who had been defined by conflict could adapt to the changing needs of a peaceful galaxy. The Mandalorian creed would evolve into a more inclusive philosophy, one that emphasized honor through preservation and defense, rather than domination. The Bounty Hunter Guild, which had long served as a conduit for Mandalorians to engage with the galaxy's underworld, would also evolve. The Guild's role in the post-Empire galaxy would shift from being a mercenary force to a more officially recognized body within the galactic economy. The Mandalorians, once feared as mercenaries, would now be seen as respected contractors for the New Republic, serving in roles such as security, intelligence gathering, and protection services. The Guild's ability to operate in the gray areas of galactic society would make them invaluable in a galaxy still dealing with the aftermath of Imperial rule and the rise of new factions. Furthermore, the Mandalorian presence in the galaxy would lead to new cultural exchange and collaboration with other species and factions. The Mandalorians' military expertise would be sought after by various planets and systems, but this would not be the same as the brutal military campaigns of their past. Instead, they would be asked to teach and share their knowledge in a way that emphasized honor and tactical skill rather than sheer force. The Mandalorians' reputation as mercenaries would give way to a new role as teachers, advisors, and cultural ambassadors. One of the most interesting developments in the Mandalorian mythos would be the evolution of Mandalorian leadership. While traditional leaders like Bo-Katan Kryze and Din Djarin had focused on the reconstruction of Mandalore, the future of the Mandalorians would be shaped by a new generation of leaders who would embody the values of unity, adaptability, and cooperation. These new leaders would be tasked with maintaining Mandalore's cultural identity while integrating their people into the broader galactic framework. The Mandalorian leadership would no longer be defined solely by military prowess, but by their ability to navigate political complexities and maintain peace in a galaxy that had long been marred by war. In the next stage of the Mandalorian journey, their mythos would be seen not as a story of military conquest, but as a testament to survival, a story of a people who had endured and adapted to a galaxy that was constantly changing. The Mandalorians' legacy would be about their ability to preserve their culture, adapt to new challenges, and find strength in cooperation. They would no longer be a people defined by conquest, but by the unity and resilience they showed in the face of a galaxy that was beginning to value peace over war. As the galaxy continued to evolve, the Mandalorians' future would be one of integration, adaptation, and cultural preservation. The Mandalorians, once a proud warrior people, would become a living legacy of how a culture could survive and thrive in a galaxy that had outgrown the need for endless conflict. Their role as guardians of their culture and mentors to other civilizations would cement their place as a vital part of the new galactic order. The final impact of the Mandalorian mythos would be their enduring spirit, a spirit that transcended war and conflict and became a symbol of resilience, honor, and adaptability. The Mandalorians' legacy would not be defined by their ability to conquer, but by their ability to endure and adapt to an ever-changing galaxy. As the galaxy moved forward, the Mandalorians would stand as a beacon of hope for all those who had been defined by conflict, showing that true strength lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the ability to preserve and adapt to a new, peaceful era. In the New Republic era, the Mandalorians would play a key role in shaping the future of galactic politics and diplomacy. The rise of the Mandalorians as a respected people, not for their military might, but for their ability to survive, would make them central to the rebuilding of the galaxy. Their influence would be felt in peace negotiations, military training, and security operations, as their warrior culture became a symbol of strength, not in combat, but in the preservation of peace. They would no longer be known as conquerors, but as preservers of culture, advisors, and guardians of tradition. Their transition from mercenaries to diplomats would be significant in the galaxy's new era. The Bounty Hunter Guild, long a means for the Mandalorians to sustain their people, would now become a more official and integrated organization within the New Republic's framework. Mandalorians would still be able to operate in the shadows of galactic politics, but their actions would be guided by a new ethos, one of restraint, loyalty, and strategic cooperation. The Guild, once an emblem of independent mercenary work, would now play a role in galactic peacekeeping, intelligence operations, and diplomatic missions, ensuring that the Mandalorians remained relevant in an ever-changing galaxy. In the military sphere, the Mandalorians would also make their mark, while no longer relying on the brutal tactics of old. They would serve as elite trainers, preparing the next generation of galactic forces for the threats that still lurked in the galaxy's dark corners. The Mandalorian armor, long synonymous with combat, would now be seen as a symbol of elite defense and honor, representing the strength to protect, not to dominate. Their expertise in combat tactics and strategy would continue to be valuable assets, ensuring that the Mandalorians would remain integral to the New Republic's efforts to maintain stability and peace across the galaxy. However, the Mandalorians' evolving role would not come without challenges. The warrior culture that had once defined them would continue to clash with the more diplomatic and peaceful goals of the New Republic. The Mandalorians would face internal struggles between those who believed their warrior roots should remain the foundation of their culture, and those who saw the need to embrace peace and diplomacy. This ideological tension would play out on Mandalore itself, as factions within the Mandalorian people debated how best to move forward in this new era. The Mandalorian people, under the leadership of figures like Bo-Katan Kryze and Din Djarin, would find themselves caught between the old ways and the new reality. Some factions, still loyal to the old warrior code, would resist efforts to modernize the Mandalorian identity, fearing that their culture would be diluted or lost altogether. Others, like Bo-Katan, would strive to integrate the Mandalorians into the galactic order without sacrificing their core values of honor and loyalty. The balance between honor and adaptation would be a defining theme in the Mandalorians' future, as they worked to find their place in a galaxy that had changed dramatically from the one they had once known. At the same time, the Mandalorians would continue to influence other cultures and civilizations. Their resilience in the face of adversity, their ability to adapt, and their commitment to their people would serve as an example to other species that had experienced conflict and strife. The Mandalorians' influence would extend beyond just military matters. They would become cultural ambassadors, sharing their values of survival, adaptability, and loyalty with others who were struggling to find their own way in a post-Empire galaxy. The Mandalorians, with their rich history and storied past, would offer a unique perspective on the importance of unity, family, and heritage in a galaxy that was rebuilding from the devastation of war. The Mandalorians' place in galactic history would also be solidified by the next generation of Mandalorians who grew up in the New Republic era. These young Mandalorians would not know the brutal battles of the Mandalorian Wars or the Great Purge, but they would inherit the values of their ancestors, the strength, honor, and resilience that had sustained their people through centuries of conflict. They would be trained in the ways of the Mandalorian Creed, but their training would be focused on preservation, defense, and cooperation, rather than domination. This new generation would be gatekeepers of Mandalorian culture, ensuring that it evolved while staying true to its core principles. As the galaxy continued to grow and evolve, the Mandalorian mythos would remain an essential part of its fabric. The Mandalorians would be seen not just as a people of war, but as a symbol of endurance, a testament to survival in the face of adversity. Their legacy would be one of adaptability, unity, and strength through preservation, showing that even the most warrior-driven cultures could find their place in a galaxy that was moving toward peace. In the broader context of the galaxy's political landscape, the Mandalorians would serve as a unique force of unity, helping to bring together various